So I saw Death on the Nile, directed by Kenneth Branagh. Didn't see Murder on the Orient Express, but let's talk about this one. Murder was just the beginning. Belgian sleuth Hercule Poirot's Egyptian vacation aboard a glamorous river steamer turns into a terrifying search for a murderer when a picture-perfect couple's idyllic honeymoon is tragically cut short. So if you're a fan of murder mysteries, I'm sure you already know Agatha Christie, and you've maybe even read some of her novels. I actually haven't read any of her books, and probably the only other adaptation I've seen that I know is based on one of her works is the original Murder on the Orient Express from the 70s, I believe, directed by Sidney Lumet. And I wasn't a big fan of that one, actually. In terms of this genre, I might not have seen as much as true fans of it, but I have enjoyed past works like Clue and Knives Out. I think part of the fun of watching movies like this is being able to point the finger at a suspect, maybe even before you've even seen anything about it. Like, you just hear about it and you hear the cast and you're like, oh, I bet it's that person. Sometimes it's not fun if you're able to predict just based on the cast, like, oh, that actor has to be the villain because that actor's always the villain. Or that actor is going to die because that actor always dies in things. In terms of Death on the Nile, I don't think it has any issues like that, where you're not really able to predict based on the casting who dies or who's the culprit. So I think I'll give it points for that. I do think, though, that where the movie fails is the structure and the pacing. The movie opens up with a introduction, I guess, to the backstory of Kenneth Branagh's character, Hercule Poirot. He's the lead detective in this series. I'm not sure if I would have had different feelings about it if I saw the first one that he directed, but in terms of seeing this as a standalone, I think the intro was only really made because it needed to bookend with an epilogue that they had. And I think it just really slowed down the pacing of the movie, because you have that intro and then you get to the meat, which is like the adventure in ancient Egypt and the murder mystery that's going to happen there. So the story follows a wedding in ancient Egypt and everybody that's invited onto a riverboat. I think the idea of having the murder set on a boat is very interesting because culprits can't escape. Everybody's on the boat, and really the only way to escape is if you get on a smaller boat and you leave the riverboat, but everybody stays on the boat. So there's no like characters disappearing off and that maybe making it a little bit more obvious. All the characters are always around, and obviously there's gonna be a culprit, and it kind of adds to the tension of like, okay, they're on this boat and they haven't left and nobody is allowed to leave. If you've seen the trailer, I think Kenneth Branagh has a scene where he says, it's like, oh, no one is leaving until I find the killer, right? So that was pretty interesting in terms of Agatha Christie's choice to have this set somewhere where nobody can really escape. In terms of the pacing, once the movie sets up the location and the general story about why these characters are all together in the same place, and they also set up some motives for why somebody might want to kill the person that gets murdered, I think that the movie actually takes too long to get to the murder. I believe I looked at my watch and it actually took probably an hour for the actual principal death on the Nile. After the murder, you start the actual process of Kenneth Branagh solving the case, or just the step-by-step process that he's gonna start interviewing people. Like, he's gonna start naming the motives. He's gonna like do the Sherlock Holmes thing where it's like, oh, because of this, you have to be the killer or whatever. And yeah, that's pretty standard in movies like this. Obviously in Knives Out, that's like what Daniel Craig does. He like interviews the people and he says their motives and why they might be the ones that actually did the murder. But from the first murder through all his process in terms of solving it to the third act resolution, it felt well paced, but that third act resolution was just way too fast. Like, it's supposed to be the payoff after all the work that he does of solving the case, and the payoff just kind of felt like it was way too fast and it wasn't satisfying. you're supposed to, in that moment, you're supposed to feel like, wow, that's what happened. Like, that's the culprit. And I just kind of felt like, oh, okay. That's basically the movie ending right there. And then it goes on for maybe 10-15 more minutes through like everything getting tied up and the epilogue that bookends with the intro. In terms of the intro and epilogue, they set up a backstory for Kenneth Branagh's character. I don't know if seeing the first movie would change my feelings about it, but in this movie, it felt pointless. It does give him a little bit of development, but it's really, I really feel that the intro was just the setup for the punchline that was the epilogue. I don't mean that it was funny or anything. I just mean that it's supposed to maybe give you an emotional reaction or get you in the character's headspace and just give a deeper like meaning to the characters and all that. But I just really cared about the main story in terms of the case, the death on the Nile, and it just felt too quick. I don't want to talk about the performances besides Kenneth Branagh's, because if I start mentioning names, you'll probably figure out who survives to the end of the movie or who the villain is, the culprit. So I'll just talk about Kenneth Branagh. I think he did a fine job. I think he definitely has his own thing going. He owns the character. Comparing it to the Hercule Poirot in the original Murder on the Orient Express, I think it's on par. It's really just a detective with a heavy French accent. I believe the character is actually Belgian, perhaps. But actually, sometimes when you're watching this movie, you might actually wish you had subtitles. So if you wait to stream it, you'll probably have a better experience than I did, because sometimes his accent's a little heavy. It's a little hard to understand him. And some of the other characters, this movie is set in the 1930s. So sometimes when people have like that old American lingo, or they kind of have their own respective accents because it's kind of an international cast, I wished that I had subtitles to help me out with that a little bit. In terms of cinematography, I thought it was really good. I think they captured that desert heat really well. And in terms of the location, I think it worked well. Obviously, it's going to be CGI. You're not going to film this in actual Egypt. It would be extremely expensive. And I don't even think this movie is doing that well in the box office anyways. So they're probably glad that they didn't try to film on location like that. I think if you're not bothered by some of the CGI-ness, I think you're going to get immersed in the world that they created here. There's sphinxes, pyramids, a crocodile, some boats, and I think it all works well to set the stage. In terms of the score, I wasn't actually a big fan of the score. I guess it was serviceable. Like, I didn't really notice it being particularly amazing or bad. So I guess that's good not to notice in some ways. And one of the characters is a singer in this, and she sings the blues. For the immersion, they actually made it sound like what a microphone would make a voice sound like in the 1930s. So if you don't like that kind of lower quality early 20s, early 30s microphone sound, and in this case, it was a little bit distracting because obviously this actress isn't the one actually singing. And it just took me out of the movie a little bit. I know it's supposed to do the opposite. It should bring you into the movie more. It's like, oh, period accurate microphone sound, and they're singing the blues. But it took me out of it a little bit, to be honest. As I mentioned earlier, there's a pacing issue. The murder happening an hour in, and then it's good pacing for the investigation, but then the third act resolution is just quick fire fast. It kind of left me feeling like, oh, okay, now the movie's over. And overall, the movie ends up feeling like maybe 30 minutes too long. Like, it definitely could have cut down. If anything, with the runtime that it currently has, they could have cut that intro and epilogue. And they could have dedicated it to better pacing in terms of the resolution. I don't know if this is a direct effect from being adapted from the Agatha Christie novel, or maybe it's the directorial choices, but I just felt like it could have had better pacing. Overall, I think I would give this movie a 2.5 out of 5 because I think it's just okay. I don't think it's worth watching in a theater unless maybe you're a Gal Gadot fan or a Kenneth Branagh fan or an Agatha Christie fan. I think it's probably a good streaming watch. Definitely if you've seen the first one in the series and you liked it and you want to keep following this world, the lead character that Kenneth Branagh plays, then you should check this out. If you haven't seen the first one, like I haven't seen it, as a standalone, it works okay. So definitely just check it out on streaming if you're bored one night. But there's probably better movies you could watch, to be honest. So that's my review. Let me know what you thought of Death on the Nile. Have you seen it already? Are you going to watch it? Have you seen the original one? Let me know down below, leave a like, and I'll catch you on the flip side.